everybody. We're going to get started with this very loud mic. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's coming out for our Pints Policy. We hold these about once a month. We like to take issues that we think need a little more exploration, sometimes issues that don't necessarily get the amount of attention that they deserve, and we like to put a spotlight on them, bring some experts in to walk you through what's really going on so you have a clear sense of what it is. I don't think too many people think that the issue of housing in New Hampshire isn't a big issue. The numerous public policy surveys have shown that this is the number one issue among granite staters at the state level, and it's not even close. I think we see it in real life. With the median home prices in New Hampshire are $500,000, and that's despite the fact we've seen interest rates spike. We're seeing housing prices go up at the same time the mortgage costs are going through the roof. So it really is an issue that's getting a lot of attention, both here in New Hampshire, but also across the country. So we've got a national expert to sort of focus on that. I think that there was a recent study that showed that right at the moment there's a 24,000 unit gap between where we are and where we would need to be to meet all the housing needs in New Hampshire. First of all, this is a state that has first world problems, right? If your problem is that so many people want to move to your state that you don't have enough places to put them, that's a good sign. Look at, for example, some states like Illinois and New York who people are fleeing those states. I look at New Hampshire as having that as a problem, but it creates a secondary problem that we don't have enough places to put all the people who want to move to the state, which is that employers can't find people to fill all the jobs that they want to have here in New Hampshire. So this is a twofold problem, but again, these are first world problems. There are states that have a lot bigger issues than we do, but they're still issues that need to be tackled and we need to bring a lot of attention to. So we brought an all-star panel, I believe, to talk about the issue. First, we have Drew Cline, the president of the Josiah Barlett Center, which is the New Hampshire's preeminent free market think tank, as they style themselves. That's right. We have Adam Millsap, who is a senior fellow for economic policy for Stand Together Trust. Full disclosure, Stand Together is a broader community that includes AFP, but Stand Together Trust really puts a lot of emphasis on bringing a lot of research and attention to areas that really need it, and then bringing resources to help solve these societal problems. And all the way over on the far right, which Joe's going to find out humorous, we have State Representative Joe Alexander. Joe is in his third term from R-Goffstown. He is the chair of the House Special Committee on Housing, and also the assistant floor leader. Is the assistant floor leader for the House Majority Office. So thank everybody for coming. I really think this is going to be a lively debate, and I have two programming notes. First and foremost, there is more food is going to continue to come throughout the event. So you're not going to see it because it's going to be behind you, but if you want to get some more food, there's going to be more food coming throughout. Also, over here, there's a table that's got a bunch of swag. If you want to be as bedecked and as handsome as Dan McGuire, we have a lot of swag. Feel free to take it. Help yourself to the swag. It's great. So anybody who wants to start looking as good as Dan, you can help yourself back there. I know we have some folks here, a number of state legislators. If you're a state legislator, could you raise your hand? So we have a bunch of state legislators here. I know we have a state senator, but that's only because he owns the place, right? And in the back, just checking in, Matt Mayberry. Matt is the president of the New Hampshire Home Builders Association, so he's a guy who has a lot of knowledge in this space as well. So we're gonna get started. I promise you, Joe's not offering that to you. So I think we'll start with Drew. Drew, Josiah Barlett has put a lot of time, effort, and energy into the housing issue. And you've done a lot of studies and worked with a number of other groups to try to find solutions to the housing issues in New Hampshire. Could you just give us a state of play? What is going on in housing in New Hampshire right now?
So I just want to start with a question for everybody. How many people in this room actually really believe in the state motto, live free or die? Right? It's pretty good, right? Even people who don't live here. But I would amend that to say these days it's live free or die unless you own property. Because live free or die does not apply to your local government regulations on your property. It just doesn't apply. They can regulate anything pretty much to any degree they want, and we just let them. And so the Josiah Barlett Center, as you guys know, we've been around for 30 years, and so primarily we've focused on state budget, spending, taxes, that red meat kind of stuff. And about 5 years ago, we started seeing how we were really doing pretty well in the state. We were still fighting for lower taxes and lower spending, but we're making marginal gains on those, like really small gains every year. And we started to look for regulatory issues we could fight on, and we found that the housing issue was just gigantic, was under the radar, prices were going up, and we started to notice that there was this constrained supply. Maine, the state of Maine, we passed Maine a little over a decade ago in population. So we now have 1.3 some million. We have more people than Maine does now by just a little bit. But Maine has 100,000 more housing units than New Hampshire does. 100,000. So just put that in perspective. The live free or die state has constrained through local government regulations its housing supply so badly that Maine has gone way ahead of us in housing, although we have the same population. So in 1998, the median price for a single family home in New Hampshire was $127,000. That was the median price in 1998. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be $239,000. That's how much a house should cost in New Hampshire today, roughly, a single family home. It actually costs $470,000. So when we talk about your local regulations and the housing supply and the housing shortage, what we're talking about is everybody who buys a house. That's your kids, your grandkids, right? I mean, I know a lot of people in here are like, look, keep the Mass residents out of New Hampshire. But what about your kids? What about grandma when she needs to downsize, right? The median price for a condo in New Hampshire, a condo, is $420,000. Because we don't have enough. We all know that if we just let the market, if you have massive demand for candy, what are candy makers going to do? They're going to make more candy. If you have massive demand for any product, the people who make that product are going to fill that demand. Why do we have massive demand in New Hampshire for homes to the point that home prices are $200,000 higher than they should be, $250,000 higher than they should be? It's because government has gotten in the way and told builders, you can't build that. And that's the lay of the land right now in New Hampshire.
Well, on that promising note, I'll turn to Adam. Adam, housing isn't just an issue exclusive to New Hampshire. It's an issue that we're looking at the national level. It might be more acute in New Hampshire than it is at the national level, but it is an issue. And so, what are the trends and changes that are driving this level of concern about the housing issue? And what are some of the other states across the country doing about it?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's nice to be here in New Hampshire. It's only my second time ever in New Hampshire, but I'm really enjoying it so far. Yeah, you're right. I mean, New Hampshire certainly has issues, but you're seeing the high housing prices pop up all over the country. A lot of it has to do with there was some shift in demand for different locations during the pandemic. You know, people trying to get away from some of the big cities, move out to areas with a little more space. I personally was one of those people that did that. I left Arlington, right outside of Washington, D.C., and moved 40 miles south down to Stafford, Virginia, to get a house that I could afford because it was very expensive to buy things in Arlington. And so you're seeing a lot more of that. So it's pushing up housing prices in places where traditionally in some of these communities, housing has been relatively cheap compared to some of the bigger cities. So some of those trends. There's also just like you're seeing more, the family formation. You're talking about the young kids, right? They want to move out of their parents' homes and they want to be getting houses of their own. And so that's increasing demand as well. You got people migrating from certain states, right? Trying to get out of some of the high tax states, people leaving California, people leaving New York, coming into places like New Hampshire. Boise, Idaho had an incredibly hot housing market over the last couple years from people fleeing California. Montana faced this same issue, and maybe we'll get into them later because they just passed some really great reforms that maybe New Hampshire could learn from. So yeah, you're seeing just people leave some of these more expensive states where the housing market has gotten really out of control, but that's putting pressure on states like New Hampshire, and so they need to adapt to that.
And it's not to say that New Hampshire is ignoring the issue. We're not ducking and hiding from it. Representative Alexander, that committee is not a normal standing committee in New Hampshire. It was created because we understood that there was a huge issue and that it's driving interest at the legislative level. You chair that committee, and can you tell us a little bit what that committee has been working on and what its plans are for next year? And I guess how also you would prioritize what you're working on for next year.
Well, so I think the speaker really did the right thing by leading on this issue and saying that specifically House Republicans, but the House is very much invested in making sure that we're increasing the supply of housing across the state. I know Representative Walsh is here. He's on the committee as well. The goal of this is to increase the supply and all of the above approach. So I would say that it comes from, like Drew outlined, it's the elderly that need to move and downsize, and it's people that want to increase, people my age that I guess is completely out of reach to purchase a home at 28 years old. Like, if I purchased it 5 years ago, and I feel like my townhouse is like doubled in value, and I've just sat on it. So it's completely out of reach for people my age. So that's really what we're trying to tackle. And I think, Drew outlined that it's municipalities, but it's also, we spent an entire year having listening sessions. The home builders were involved. There's different groups that are actually here right now that have come present on some of the issues going on. And we've identified that it's also a little bit of state agencies that are coming in and kind of slowing the ball rolling on approval processes. So we're kind of looking at a bunch of different things, not just local regulations.
Great, and Drew, I got to tell you, we talk about housing. What are some of the specific barriers that are in the way? What are the things that are blocking? I know you did a report with St. Anselm's recently looking at a number of these issues. What are the top issues that are the barriers for us to actually allow supply and demand to equalize?
Yeah, so I won't spend all the time here that we could talking about this stuff. So what we did, we hired Jason Sorens from St. Anselm College. He was there at the time to do a real thorough economic study, a very, very exhaustive study, to look and control for all the factors that he could think of and try to find what was actually causing our shortage. And lo and behold, it turned out that local government regulations are preventing builders from building enough housing. And what Jason did is he compared all kinds of factors and found we have actually a list of towns like Newcastle, Rye, Portsmouth, Hanover, Lebanon, Moulton Borough, places like that where the regulations are so bad. That's where they're just shooting things right off those are the worst places in the state. But towns like Bedford are really bad. But even cities like Manchester, where you think, well, this is a place that isn't that opposed to it, has spent decades saying no to apartments, saying no to duplexes. Right? So Manchester, New Hampshire, in its buildable land, the land that's available to build on, only 18% of that they allow duplexes on. Like most of our cities in New Hampshire are in the 40s, 30s, 50s, even 60% of their buildable land they'll allow a duplex. So what we find when we look at the zoning regulations is that, one, you have zoning in these large categories that says, okay, in X percentage of the town, we're only going to allow single-family housing and nothing else. Over here, we're going to allow commercial and nothing else. Here we'll allow industrial. Here we'll allow mixed use. Here we'll allow multifamily housing. That originated, people think that that's like a New England thing. That originated in Germany in the 1870s. The first state to do this stuff was California. We have imported California zoning regulations into New Hampshire in the 60s and 70s. And so all of these things make it harder to build by segregating. But then you have stuff like, for example, the zones are too big. So you might say, well, we're only going to allow duplexes and triplexes and fourplexes in this tiny little section of town, we're not going to allow them in the commercial zone where we have strip malls and shopping centers and restaurants, where young people want to live and work. But a lot of towns don't allow housing in those areas. So it's that kind of stuff. But also, you have frontage requirements. So you have setbacks. Homeowners know this stuff, right? So in some towns in New Hampshire, you have to be 30 feet from the street. In some towns, you have to be 100 feet from the street, your house. Like, this makes no sense in New England, right? So there's all kinds of things. There's setbacks requirements. There's all these little things, density requirements. When you combine them all together, it makes it very difficult to build at all. Single-family lot sizes are a major problem. So there are only a handful of towns in New Hampshire that allow a single-family house on 1 acre or less. That's a very small percentage of the land in New Hampshire. Most towns require 2 acres or more. Some towns require 5 acres. In some rural areas, they require 25 acres to build one house on. So if you can picture, I just want to really quickly give you guys, because I want you to picture what I'm talking about. We've literally made New England illegal in New Hampshire. And by that I mean, picture Amherst Village. So everybody's been to Amherst probably around here. Picture Amherst Village. Picture postcard town, right? Beautiful. Now just picture what's actually there. You've got the green. What surrounds the green in Amherst Village? The quintessential quaint New England village that was built in the 1800s. You've got all these big houses, right? They're right next to each other. Most of those houses are on less than a 1 acre lot. You have a church, a house, a gas station, not making this up, another commercial building. Go around Amherst Village, and it's mixed use. You've got a gas station next to you've got a convenience store right there. Picture the Moulton store right across the street from Moulton's on Main Street in Amherst is a duplex. I'm not kidding, it's a duplex right there. But that is illegal once you get out of the Amherst Village, because that was built before zoning. After zoning, you'll see these big single-family houses on multi-acre lots. No duplexes, no shops, no stores. So I want you to imagine, if you picture your place where you want to live, would you rather live in Amherst Village or South Willow Street? Right? South Willow Street exists because of zoning. We said you can only build commercial right here. That's all you can build. You can't build anything else. Well, that's what you get. So we just need to rethink the way we force people into these different zones and try to be more flexible with it, and that would help us out a lot.
Adam, I think a lot of the tension that comes up in these housing really comes sort of the somewhere in between the arguments of property rights and local preference. And so we see that tension between property rights and local preference. Because, I mean, zoning and planning exists to take away people's property rights, right? If there were no zoning and planning, you could do whatever you want with your property. As a matter of public policy, how do we address that? How do we look at that approach and try to address that tension?
Yeah, I think it's making sure that people are clear about what we're talking about. So I think Drew did a very good job of laying out. I've never been to Amherst Village, but I think people do have a soft spot for some of these older, very walkable kind of downtowns. And when you look at the development that you see there, to his point, it's functionally illegal in most places in this country. You can't have mixed use. You can't have residential near commercial. You don't have houses on quarter-acre lots or even like fifth-acre lots. Everything's on an acre, 2 acres, 3 acres, and that makes it very unwalkable. So you can't have these kind of main streets that people think about. People think about the 50s, and there's a lot of nostalgia and romanticism around the 50s. But look at Leave It to Beaver's neighborhood. He could touch it. He could see his neighbor's house. It wasn't through like an acre of woods and somewhere over there in the distance, right? I mean, it was right there next to it. So even those 1950s neighborhoods that a lot of you probably grew up in, or had parents who grew up in those neighborhoods, just way different than the neighborhoods we see today. And so we can get back to that. So I think part of it is letting people know that when we talk about increasing density, people use terms like missing middle, accessory dwelling units, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. We're not talking about turning places into like Manhattan, right? This doesn't have to look like Hong Kong. We're talking about bringing back the Main Street neighborhood from like the 40s, 50s, and 60s in a way that is just functionally illegal today. So I think when you show people pictures of what you're talking about, that can help a little bit. with kind of disarming them about what like the worst might look like, so not thinking it's going to be, like I said, turn into a big city. And in terms of local control, there's nothing more local than the individual, right? I mean, the individual property owner is the most local it gets. So if you really care about local control, it's about just giving the individual property owner their rights back. So I think that's something that we should keep in mind when we're talking about this issue.
And Joe, I know we've said some things that might seem a little bit depressing to the average person, but there is some good news. There is some good news. In the state budget, in House Bill 2, but initially it was a bill that ran through your committee in Judiciary, was the development and creation of a land use docket in Superior Court. And one thing that we knew and we heard was that if you brought a land use case to court, you would be at least 3 years before resolution. 3 years, imagine that. That's not exactly what I think most people would consider justice in a traditional sense. And what this land use court docket will do is first of all, you'll have one judge, so you'll have consistent rulings, and then you can get a result within as little as 5 months. Can you talk a little about you obviously you're on the committee, you debated the bill, but now you're on the housing committee and you're sort of looking at the prospects of how that can improve the housing situation in New Hampshire.
There was a ton of need to have this streamlined in the judicial process because 3 years is too long, and if I was a developer, I'd walk away. I'd be like, you know what, it's not worth it for me. I don't want to spend all this time, this money, liquidating all this stuff. So there's the land use docket, which we just approved, which would give one judge, it'd be consistent. There's also another part of the judicial system that's the Housing Appeals Board, which kind of acts in a quasi-judicial way, which does the same thing. That board is a board of 3 people. It's 3 experts in the field that make those rulings. And the Housing Appeals Board is functioning how it's supposed to be functioning. It's making the approval process go faster. It's requiring that towns don't step out of bounds because keep in mind, like a lot of these planning and zoning board members, I don't knock them, they're great people. They get elected with 20% of the vote, right? Nobody votes in town elections. I go in, I get elected 85, 90% of the vote. I'm like, look, we need more housing. Everyone's like, okay, great, that sounds good. We need to go in and identify that this is part of the problem is that it needs to be streamlined and quicker approval process. So that's part of what the Housing Committee dealt with, and that's part of what the Housing Appeals Board and the docket would have done. So in theory, it would speed it up.
Yeah, and Joe, I just think it's important to point out that the Housing Appeals Board, for example, developers don't always win.
They don't.
Like it doesn't undo your local zoning. It just says, hey, did you follow the law and did you follow your own rules? And sometimes yeah, right, but they don't always. The point is, you got to follow the rules and the law, and so that's just a step to make sure that everybody's doing that. And
Drew, obviously in New Hampshire, as much as everyone likes to talk about local control, we're not a home rule state. The legislature empowers local governments to do. They give them any authority they have. But looking at that from the discussion of local control. And yet, knowing that we have these real shortages, we're having these real inabilities to meet our basic needs from our workforce percentage, from a housing perspective, at what point does the state need to step in and say and reassess? Hey, how much authority have we given you, and have we given you too much of a blank check?
Right. I mean, government. I think most of us here would agree. Government exists to protect our rights. That's in the Declaration of Independence. That's the whole purpose of government. And so when one level of government starts to infringe on your rights, you wouldn't accept your local government taking away your guns or passing regulations, on free speech or any number of things. But local government vastly restricts what you can do with your property, and then people just shrug. And like we don't actually have property rights. Like your neighbors control what you can do with your land to an inordinate degree. And I think economically, when we look at this as a free market people, we say, you should have property rights, but we also want to avoid what economists call externalities, right? So you don't want to build the 10-story apartment building in a residential neighborhood and cast shadows over there because that harms your neighbor, right? So you can have reasonable restrictions and regulations. I personally have been warning legislators, and we've been writing about this for years, that we don't want we want to avoid state taking action. I just think that's, like, for me, I'd rather the state not take any action at all. I'd rather we try to talk to locals and get them to understand that they have control to change this. But what we've been saying is, if you don't, prices are going so high, people are getting so fed up with this, eventually people are going to demand that the state act. If local boards don't change this, they will do that, and they're already doing that. And he knows, like, they're coming to the legislators saying, you've got to change this. My preference would be more along the lines of enabling legislation, and let me give you an example. Right now, we have zoning that covers big zones, right, of your whole town. Well, I think with some enabling legislation from the legislature, maybe we let municipalities have neighborhood zoning boards. Why do you have to have a zoning board that governs your entire town? Why not have neighbors get together and do these things at the much more micro level? So that's one way you can sort of say, maybe we're making this a little more local. But I think eventually legislators are going to have to take some steps, and then some of those steps might be along the lines of, you know what? Maybe we just say you can't have a minimum lot size of more than 2 acres. You just can't. We're just going to take that away from you. That doesn't make any sense, right?
2 acres, good. I mean,
I'm just.
Hope we get
I'm trying
less than that.
I'm trying to give people, throw people a bone here, all right? You know.
Just real quick, if I could add something to that.
Right, no, that's right.
If I want to just jump in real quick, because I think the externalities point you made was really good, and people talk about that. But zoning, even before zoning, we handled externalities with just nuisance law. Yes. I mean, the problem now is that zoning just assumes things are going to be nuisances and then makes you prove the negative that they're not going to be. But that just doesn't make any darn sense. No one says, prove to me Bigfoot isn't real. You can't do that, right? The onus of the burden of proof is on the person that says Bigfoot is real. So if something's going to be a nuisance, the shifting that burden of proof around and say, you need to tell me why this duplex is going to be a nuisance. We're not going to take your word for it. So we're going to allow those things by right, unless you can demonstrate to us what the big problem is going to be. This is how we dealt with these issues, prior to like the 1970s for the most part. Even after zoning law became kind of common in the 20s and 30s, they still didn't bind as much as they do post like 1970, 1980 when all the environmental stuff came into play. So we've handled this humanity has handled this kind of stuff for 1,000 years before we had zoning, right? We had towns and cities in Europe, in the Middle Age. Rome had to deal with this kind of stuff, and they didn't have zoning laws, right?
I have a bill in that's regarding manufactured housing. So again, manufactured housing will help elderly, but also people my age that want to buy their first home. So does anyone know the square feet of a unit that would be up to New Hampshire building code, the minimum amount of square feet you need? 170. So we heard that in the housing committee. It's 170 square feet. So that is what you need to follow New Hampshire building code. So when we talk about tiny houses, it doesn't have to be 170 square feet, but it should be giving people the opportunity to start small, like my parents did, like my grandparents did, and expand. And we just don't have the local zoning allowed for any manufactured housing. I mean, if you look at the zoning atlas by St. Anselm College, great resource to be used, but there's just no opportunity to build manufactured housing.
And I think that this is great, but it also, I think that one of the things that we think about is, we're making a lot of decisions by crisis as opposed to letting the market drive these forces. And the problem is that housing doesn't go up and down as these crises come and go. You build a house, it's probably going to be there a while, right? And I think that allowing sort of the water to seek its own level definitely creates an environment where you have a durable solution, because houses are a durable problem. But Adam, I really want to drill into this as like looking over the horizon, thinking about the long term. What are sort of like, looking over the horizon, what are sort of the changes and changes that are happening to try to meet up? We have the supply-demand imbalance, largely because of some regulatory restrictions. How is technology evolving to deal with that? Are there new technologies coming online? Are there new approaches, new strategies to tackling some of these problems that are being created by some of this restrictive regulations?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely new ways to build homes that we don't do nearly enough of. To your point about the manufactured housing, there's the 3D printing. I saw there was a documentary on this recently where they built some houses in Mexico. It looked pretty neat. I don't know how effective it would be at scale, but we should at least be allowed to try these things, right? The whole point is experimentation. And right now with many building codes, that's just impossible to do. There's the manufactured like modular housing where you assemble the walls and everything in the factory and then you drive them out to the site and you can put them up in 3 days. One of the things people hate about new construction is that it's messy and dirty and takes a long time. But there's ways to get around that with some of these new building techniques if we just allowed it to happen more. And currently we don't do that, right? So I think there are certainly things on the building side with these like modular construction. There's this thing called mass timber where they can build 10-story buildings much cheaper than they can with steel, and they're just as strong and they last a long time. That we're just not currently doing at scale that I think we could. And the building code is a kind of a whole separate beast that needs to be tackled, I think, at some point after the land use regulations does. But there are ways to build housing much cheaper in a way that we just haven't done, and we just traditionally use the stick-built. There's a labor shortage in the stick-built, which is also making it more expensive. It's hard to find carpenters. It's hard to find plumbers. Why can't we do all that stuff in the factory and then just bring it out to the site and put it all together? It goes much faster.
Well, there's something that I don't think Washington State does a lot of good things well, but the one thing that I think they are doing well is they have this state database where they have pre-approved, based on building code, modular units that somebody could just pull the plan right off the website and build their home on. So that's a really cool kind of thing that the state government's doing, is the recommended sort of what would go up to code and what could you build right now.
Remember when people used to build their own houses with Sears catalog homes? Yeah. I mean, this was like a thing. Can you imagine that today? I mean, that's just crazy to think that we used to. And that's not even that long ago, right? The 40s and 50s. You could just order a house off a catalog. It came with a lot of the exterior pieces. You put the walls together. Then you had to go out and get some plumbing and stuff. But to think of us, we could do that now in a much cheaper way. It could really be assembled. You call your buddies over. You crack open a case of beer and you throw your walls together. We could do this stuff.
IKEA housing.
Yeah, the housing of IKEA. We could do this.
Well, the house I grew up in is the same floor plan and design as a Sears catalog home. I don't know if it was, but it could have been, and it was built in the 20s. So we had mail order homes in the 20s, which we don't have anymore, and it's a shame.
And Joe, talk a little bit about people of your age, your generation, and I know you have a lot of contemporaries that you interact with. And the idea of home ownership right now for a lot of those people just seems so far away. And how do we address that, or how do we get those folks to raise their voice so that it sort of has an impact and people begin to understand sort of what they're going through and the desire, if you want to buy your own home, you're going to have to leave New Hampshire?
Well, it partly is a generational issue because keep in mind, maybe when Drew was my age, the price of a house, no offense, the price of a house was a hell of a lot cheaper than it is now. So you think of what it's like for somebody to, first of all, pay $2,000 a month for a 2-bedroom unit, apartment, and then they have to save up enough for a down payment for a house that's $200,000 or valued $200,000 more than it should be valued at. It's just completely unobtainable. So if you want to reach out and hit the next generation of voters, this is the best issue to hit them with, is to tell them that we're on your side. We want less regulation. We want more property rights, increased supply. That's where people are at my age.
And this is for any of you who are interested, but probably Drew and Joe. Our solutions so far haven't been great. The land use docket was a good solution, but our solutions have basically just been, let's throw lots of money at this. Essentially, we're bribing developers to deal with the rigmarole of some of these restrictions when they would just want to build. And can you talk a little bit about how we can maybe get past that and get to an environment where we don't have to use taxpayer dollars to subsidize these folks wanting to build and have to deal with the costs?
It's really simple. Get government out of the way. I mean, that's a flippant remark, but it's not. I mean, pick any industry, just any off the top of your head, whatever field you're in, any industry in the world. I remember hearing that, people blame developers because they wouldn't build houses. I mean, What is it? You blame Keith Murphy for not making cheeseburgers? Like, that makes no sense. If you go into business to do something, you want to do that. I've talked to developers regularly who say, I wish they would let me build the house I grew up in. A lot of developers in New Hampshire did not start rich. They started low to middle income. And they want to build homes for people like their families. But local governments won't let them. The way we solve this without throwing more money at it is to have people who understand the connection between those local regulations and the shortage of housing run for your planning board, run for your zoning board, roll those regulations back, and get the regulations out of the way. And then developers will build those small houses. They'll build those entry-level houses. They'll build the duplexes. They'll build the condos. They'll build the things that we need in this market. That's the answer.
And I want to bring somebody else who obviously has some experience into this discussion, and that is Matt Maybury from New Hampshire Home Builders. Matt, do you want to come up here and say a few words and give the home builders perspective?
Greg, thank you, and thank you all for being here because you care. How many of you want to see more housing in your communities? Just raise your hand. Great, so say 40 people. That's 40 candidates for planning board and zoning board. Stop sitting on your butt bitching about it and go change it. Greg and AFP don't want to see taxes raised. They go knock on doors. They elect candidates. They put muscle behind their mouth. So from the home builder's perspective, what we're saying is, do something about it. Stop bitching about it and go fix it. I say that to my builders all the time. Earlier today, I met with DES because there's a little rule change that got approved through a consent calendar. For one development, for 21 homes, it's going to cost them an additional $250,000. And they just said, well, we're just trying to protect the environment. The same people who are telling you we want affordable housing, they just want it in your community. Those folks who say that, oh, we need workforce housing, they want it in your community, not theirs. Notice the towns with the strictest zoning: Hanover, Durham, Portsmouth, Keene. Noticing a trend, folks? They want it in your town. We're trying really hard. We're working hard. We're working with the New Hampshire Corrections Department to increase labor. We're talking to every community out there saying a job in the trades is worth it. You will make money. It's forums like this where you folks come out and vote in your towns and say, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do for zoning? Simple things, folks. Allow ADUs in your communities. If you have a 6-bedroom house or room over a garage, make it into a unit. You can stay in your home longer. You provide housing. It's there. We are trying, but it is that red tape again and again and again and again. And Senator Keith Murphy came to the home builders and said, developers, builders, tell me what rules you want me to cut. Not change, cut. We're trying, you're trying, and Greg, thank you for the moment. I'm begging you, if you want to see housing, run for planning board, run for zoning board, run for town council, and make it happen because you can. We're trying, we're going to keep trying, but thank you all very much for the opportunity just to say hi, and keep going. Thank you.
Thanks. We've heard a lot of great stuff, but now it's time we want to open it up to folks out there. Any questions that you might have? Dan looks like he has a question.
Or complaints. We'll take complaints too.
Thanks. I am on planning board. We meet tomorrow, by the way. So density is the way to get housing prices down. Let me ask a practical question about density. How much is the septic and water control how the smallest lot you can have, right? What's the smallest lot you can practically have per bedroom, I guess? to have enough water that you're never going to have a problem, to have enough septic space that you're never going to have a problem?
Well, I don't know if I can give you the definitive answer, but I can give you a personal answer. So my house in my town was built in the George Washington administration, and there was no zoning, and the farm property around it was sold off over the many years, and I have septic and well on a 0.7 acre lot. So all these people who tell you need 2 acres are not telling the truth. You can do it in under an acre.
I would just want to add that as some place that has just a city water and sewer and stuff like that, when I hear this question about the infrastructure, a lot of times people say, well, we need government because it needs to provide infrastructure. If it's unwilling to even do that, then what do we even need it for? We shouldn't rely on this idea that we can't build new housing because we don't have the infrastructure for it. It's like, that's the reason apparently that's one of the reasons that people think we need to have government, but now you're telling me we don't even do that either? They don't even want to build sewer? They don't even want to go to water? Well, then get them the hell out of here. We don't even need them at all. Put my own septic tank in. So I just think we need this idea that the infrastructure can't keep up with the housing, that's the exact wrong way to think about it. It's the government's job to keep up with the housing. If people want to live there, it's the government's job to make it possible. It's what we pay taxes for. There's other ways to get around that stuff too. There's impact fees, which I'm not opposed to. I think you can do impact fees in a way that's reasonable and make the developers and the new housing people pay for some of the infrastructure. You can keep them within reason, charge the marginal cost of adding additional sewage lines or water lines or whatever. But this idea that people try to hide behind, we don't have enough infrastructure so we can't build more housing, it's like, well, tell your government just to quit and go home because they can't even do one of their core functions apparently.
Well, and I wish Representative McConkey was here because he's a leader on our committee about that regarding DES, and he's gotten DES to relax on some of this septic stuff. But if you want to look at something more reasonable for zoning, go to septic zoning. Go to something that's scientific based that you can say you can only regulate the amount that you need in order to have a septic tank.
Representative Walsh, you look like you had a question. Okay.
Thank you all. I was expecting a debate tonight, not a sales pitch, but thank you very much. In terms of and I'll answer the last question I heard first about how big your lot needs to be for septic and sewer. It all depends on how it perks. I mean, so to say a half acre is enough or 2 acres is enough, you really don't know until you look at the actual soil.
Yeah. But I think that was Adam's point, which is it should, or Joe's point, it should be flexible, not hard.
Well,
right?
it's hard to do that in a regulation, but I get that. But the main reason I came up, because I was on the planning board in Hooksett, 15,000 people. For 12 years, I was vice chair for 3, chair for 2. So I'm pretty familiar with how this all works. And we've got a pretty flexible zoning ordinance. We have urban density, we have medium density, we have low density, it all depends. And all I'm hearing tonight is everybody hates that. But it really isn't that bad, and that's not the problem. I sat on this committee, the Special Committee on Housing, and with the exception of 2 developers that were annoyed by zoning ordinance, the majority of them, the problem was cost, and the problem was regulations, and the cost of the regulations. So to keep hearing this harp on the zoning that is actually decided upon by the citizens that live there, I'm getting tired of it. I don't know how else to say it. The reason a lot of people are also opposed to increasing our density, aside from the ones that actually worked in Massachusetts for a day and saw what we might have as a goal here by increasing our density, has anybody looked at our school budgets lately? And so I'm in a town of 15,000 people, and we have a $40 million school budget. And I know the first thing you're going to say, most of these schools have room for a few more students before the budget's going to have to go up, but I don't buy it. The people that live in these towns that actually that vote on the zoning actually kind of have a clue what's going on, and they have a fear of what the density, the traffic, and their budgets are going to be. We did a study about 18 years ago in Hooksett. The line in the sand was, say, $200,000. Homes under $200,000, for every dollar of revenue we took in, it cost us $1.25 to pay for the services. And then over that, we actually made some money. So the wash was there. But I mean, to just continually to keep harping on the decisions that the people of the towns they live in is getting old. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Representative Walsh. So I actually testified before the Hooksett Planning Board on, because you have a building in Hooksett that was is owned by Brady Sullivan now. It used to be Cigna office headquarters, and the planning board will not allow it to be converted to housing because it's zoned for office, even though it's in a residential area. There's housing right across the street from it. And when I testified, I pointed out that the people were saying you can't have this because it's going to increase the school budget. Well, the maximum number of kids in that unit, if every single unit had a kid, would have been 73 kids, and we know that wouldn't happen. It'd be like 2 kids in that building. Over the previous couple of years, the school lost 200 students. So yeah, there's room in your schools. School populations have declined in New Hampshire. We are down about 50,000 students in New Hampshire. Every town in the state has lost school population. You have, except for maybe a couple. There's massive room in the schools. If you don't build new housing and you don't have kids in your schools, you're going to end up like Manchester, having to close schools. So you can close your schools, or you can allow families to build and revive those schools. I mean, that's your option. Your towns, your communities are going to shrink or grow, one way or the other. And communities in New Hampshire are choosing to shrink, and that's a weird choice to me.
I can just make a couple quick comments. So I totally agree with you. Homeowners love zoning. Most of them do, right? It's a way to protect their property, drive up the property value, use it as an asset in retirement potentially. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, homeowners love zoning, but they're not the only constituencies that matter. This is one reason why you talk about kicking up to the state. People brought up the externalities at the local level. There's an externality at the state level as well when some communities don't build and they push those people into other communities and they have to deal with it, right? So if we're talking about addressing externalities, there's a reason for the state to come in and address some of those externalities too. I'd also say the data shows that denser environments make way more money per head than more spread out environments when it comes to tax revenue. That's just a fact, and I'd be happy to send you the studies. I just know that's true. And on the third point about no children. So I'm from Dayton, Ohio. I don't know if you guys have heard of Dayton, Ohio, but it's one of those like quintessential Midwestern Rust Belt cities that got hollowed out in like the 60s and 70s and 80s. So I can tell you that a city that's not growing is dying. And when you go look around in some of these communities in the Midwest and you look at what a dying city looks like, it's way worse than any problems you're going to deal with growth, right? So if you think you don't need kids today, you don't care about your schools shutting down, what that looks like 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when your city starts dying like a dying star, sucking in everything else around it, it's not going to be good. So to Drew's point, you're either growing or dying. There's no stabilization. Everyone thinks like, oh, we're a good size. We're just going to stay like 15,000 people. You can't balance population on a knife's edge like that. You're either growing or you're dying, and you should pick one.
And Joe, you grew up in an environment up in Berlin, and so you've seen what that's like firsthand. Concord, same thing. But no, you know, in terms of balancing that up at the committee level, you know, I'm sure that a lot of the things you're hearing today are things you've heard within your committee as well.
Well, I also serve on a local committee, and we get budget committee. I'm chair of the local budget committee, and we get presentations on the school budget. And you know, populations in Goffstown are staying steady, but mostly around the state they're going down. And I think we need to be careful when we say we don't want to build housing because we don't want more students, we don't want more children. Like that gets almost an argument of discrimination based on the age of the person coming in, and that we got to stay away from that. We got to look at it being like we want everybody to come in, we want all ages to come in, and so that's why when some people say we don't want this housing because we don't want more students, it's like, okay, well, these are families. Are you against families? You know, like that.
One point, non-argumentative.
Sure. Go ahead, Tom.
Non-argumentative, I promise. In terms of statistics and growth and dead cities, most of the towns in southern New Hampshire, particularly Merrimack Valley, have grown in the last 20 years between 200% and 300%. The cities only grew about 40 to 50%. So your Manchester, Nashua, they were lagging in the growth. Perhaps if they hadn't, we might not be in the situation we are in now. But to say that we're not growing isn't a fallacy as well. They're still growing, and they're going to grow naturally. I just don't see the encouragement. And you know one question I asked on day one of the special committee on
Here comes the
housing.
argumentative part.
Has anybody talked about the effect of the federal government illegal immigration on our housing stock?
Yeah, so I have to give Hooksett its credit. Hooksett in the region is pretty good on zoning. It's one of the better towns, I have to say. I don't know if I want to get into some of the details, but you're right that the cities haven't pulled their weight. He's absolutely right about that. That's why Manchester is building, depending on the estimate, between 1,700 and 2,000 new units in the last couple of years. Those are planned because it knows it's behind the curve. And so the towns around Manchester, including Hooksett, have made that decision to say, well, Manchester's not building, so we're not going to build either. And so what we found in our study is there actually is an arms race. You see when one town does really strict zoning and regulations that cut down on housing, the towns around it follow because nobody wants that overflow. They think that, I got to protect my town, so we'll pass protective zoning too because the town next door did. And you create an arms race, and that's when you get people turning to the state to solve the problem.
Well, I mean, you also have Nashua. I mean, if you look at some of the roll calls of some of these representatives that are voting from Nashua, like they're really bad on housing, and they're from one of the largest cities in New Hampshire. Salem's doing a great job. The way Salem's developing and growing, I think it's great for the southern part of New Hampshire. So it's not a partisan issue at all. Like this should not be partisan. It's very much.
Yeah. I'll say this, and it's one thing. I mean, AFP is a pretty liberty-oriented organization, and I know a lot of people here are pretty liberty-oriented. The argument, which seems at its face to be a powerful one, which is these are regulations that citizens are voting in themselves, but this really talks to the point of the difference between a democracy and a republic. So if it's the four of us and we're voting and we're voting as we're the one to take Adam's sweater away. And three of us vote yes, and he votes no. Yeah, yes, we did have a vote.
I was thinking of voting to do that anyway.
So understand that it's property rights for a reason. I mean, this is something that we have been enshrined since the very basis of our country. Property rights are one of the fundamental reasons why we're not British, because we would not tolerate the British not respecting our property rights.
Well, I got to throw this in there though. The British would not tolerate our zoning. The United States and Canada are the only two countries on earth that have single-family zoning the way we have it. Like the British are freer with their property when it comes to building homes than we are. So consider that.
So anyway, I just think as we discuss the argument of, well, it was voted in by the people. Yeah, well, if this person they don't like,
Yeah.
but that's the point of having a republic is that
I'd like to
in a
ask
republic,
you about Nashville.
in a republic, your rights are protected by the government, and as opposed to a democracy where it's mob rule. So, Commissioner.
I'm sorry. I'm from Nashville, and Nashville is distinctly different from most of you here. Obviously, we're the second largest city in the state. In Nashville, we have right now 2,000 units going up this year. Of the 2,000, 1,000 are in inner city Nashville. One of them I know of is 216 units. It has no green space whatsoever. It has 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, and 5 bedrooms. Won't be any children in that building, will they? Where are those kids going to play? They're going to be in inner city downtown Nashville. And I am not suggesting to you that you don't need some regulation over the government. That's always an issue. But I am suggesting that if we go into this too quickly and we do things without analytical thinking, without study, without careful caution, there are going to be penalties, losses. And those kids will be, what will happen is, where will those kids, it's right in, I'm talking about inner city Nashville. So those kids, their playground are going to be the sidewalks of downtown Nashville. And that is partisan, going to this gentleman's point, because in Nashville we do have a Democratic mayor. And from what I'm assuming, and you can expand on this for me because you can probably educate me, I've only been selling real estate 50 years, so I'm sure you know a lot. And I'm not trying to give you all a hard time. I'm just saying that there are two sides. And poor people, that we have people who never hope to have a house. They will never have a home. So do we have some responsibility to them? I think we do. And to put that many children on the streets of downtown Nashville and at the same time tell me you're going to have people, high-end people living in downtown Nashville, that is going to this gentleman's, wherever he is, he was right on target. You're just not going to have that happen. So I just beg you to be careful as you jump.
I'd like to say 2 points. First of all, you said this shouldn't be done with a lot of studying. One thing I'll tell you is that in the housing space, there is more studying than you can imagine. There are more studies. I mean, Adam lives and breathes in this world. And he
How
will
are you
tell
going to control then this green space that I'm talking about? Literally, these children are going to be living in the streets of downtown
Well,
Nashville. Good for downtown Nashville business, I'm sure, right? When those kids come in and steal.
Well, that might upset you, and
Crime down there is
I just
terrible.
would respectfully say that there are lots of people who live in housing types that I don't prefer, and I think one of the answers here is to understand that everybody has a different preference, and so freedom means you get to choose the type of housing that you prefer, and I prefer my old George Washington administration home, but lots of people like urban living. Lots of people like that. And lots of kids grow up in big cities and turn out fine, like this guy.
I think there's a difference. I respectfully, I'm not trying, all I'm saying to you is, I live in downtown Nashville. I'm telling you that we have about 60% of our kids in Nashville that I believe are in poverty. And I'm talking about real poverty. The nation quantifies poverty as $20,000 for 4 people. I would tell you that's not poverty, that's ridiculous. Not only can they not live, one person can't live on $20,000 in my view. So maybe I'm being a little concerned. All I'm saying is, am I my brother's keeper? To some extent we are, and we have to be very careful how I agree that obviously, and maybe it's just because Nashville, maybe afterwards you can share with me how I can stop our mayor from going crazy. So I'm just telling you, I think there's a limit. I think when you put almost 1,000 units in the middle of downtown Nashville with no green space, and most of them are children, I don't know. I'm a woman. I wouldn't stand for that.
No, I mean, there's legitimate concerns, sure, but I think the question is, and I think you're kind of hitting on this, Drew, is compared to what, right? You always want to think of what is a realistic alternative for these kids if not living in these communities in downtown. I don't know the name of this town. What's the name of this town?
Nashua.
I don't know my New Hampshire geography very well, but you have to think about what is the alternative, right? People make the same kind of argument, trying to take us a little bit to a different point. Like, think of like scope of practice laws around like doctors and nurses, right? A lot of doctors will say, well, we can't let this nurse, help this person out because they don't know as much as me because I'm a doctor and everyone deserves to go see a doctor. Okay, that's true, but doctors are more expensive. There's less of them. They don't operate. A lot of them don't want to live in particular rural areas because of the amenities they enjoy. So the question is not between doctor and nurse who is allowed to do the scope of practice. The question is between nurse or nobody, right? That's the real alternative. So when we're thinking about this housing in downtown Nashua, the question is not these 500 units with a really nice green space. Maybe the alternative is these units or something worse. These people don't live in this neighborhood. They live somewhere else. They live further away from their jobs, right? There's always, you got to think about what the real alternative is. And typically, I think sometimes most of us who grow up in a suburban or kind of rural environment, right? We think everyone likes that or everyone deserves that or everyone should have that. But a lot of times that's not the relevant alternative that's actually being discussed. And so just thinking about what is the trade-off? I think that's important.
And I'd point out that some of the stuff you're seeing right now is a snapback as a reaction. If we sort of allowed more relaxed building standards earlier, there wouldn't necessarily be a demand for a 220 unit facility. And I think that this is what you're seeing is a large case is sort of the pendulum swinging back hard, and that's a consequence of decades of the policies that we've had.
Yeah, our study that we did in 2021, and you can go to jbartlett.org and search in the search tab for housing study, it'll come up. We found exactly that New Hampshire, most of the zoning, the California style, I will reiterate, zoning regulations that we have in New Hampshire started in the 60s and 70s, and they were a response to population growth. And what they did was they really choked off new housing development, which then in those towns choked off growth that now we're suddenly playing catch up on. And that's why Nashua is playing catch up. That's why Manchester is playing catch up. It's why a lot of towns around here are trying to build rapidly because we just we constrained it for too long.
Thanks. So I'm a millennial. I'm also a landlord. I spent about 10 years saving up to buy a 3-family on Merrimack Street in Manchester here. I'd like to someday raise a family here, but I'm not sure if any of you guys here, I know many of you are from out of town, be it Hooksett or Nashua or anywhere, I've taken this walk down Merrimack Street and seen the state it's in and what the lack of housing has done to this city. But that's kind of the context for what my question is, which is mainly for Rep. Alexander. So in June of this year, Vermont passed a bill called the Home Act, which basically does upzoning. So here in Manchester, you have to have 2 parking spaces for every unit, for every bedroom. So if you wanted to build a 3-family, you'd have to have 6 parking spaces to build a new 3-family. So the entire multifamily base here for 3 families. We're not talking about skyscrapers. We're talking about 3 families. You'd have to have 6 parking spaces. That law that Vermont just passed would strip that away and make it just one parking space per unit. Also, for any single-family zone, you basically you could have a duplex. Or if it's water and sewage, 3 or 4 units. So my question is there bipartisan will in the State House to do something similar?
That's a great question. I think what we talked about is there was conversation in the special committee around parking minimums, and specifically around ADUs, because a municipality might say that, sure, you can build as many ADUs as you want, but you need to have 4 parking spaces per ADU that you build. So I think there's language going into one of the ADU bills that would restrict it to 1 parking space per bedroom per unit, which I believe you shouldn't need more than 1 per bedroom per unit. If you want more, sure, but we have to talk about need, too much government regulation. I would say yes. So the Home Act sounds I would say there's bipartisan push for some of this stuff, but I think, like I said, there's people in all parts of the House that are against it, and there's all parts that are for it. So it's not really a partisan issue per se. That would be my answer for you.
I just want to address just in general, because I think there might be some misunderstanding here, and I appreciate the pushback that we've gotten. I really honestly do. But when we say zoning and land use regulations are the problem, it doesn't then follow that you have to abolish zoning. I just want to be super clear about that. You don't have to abolish zoning, right, to make a big dent in this problem. One of the things we've pointed out is you can just change your zoning laws to say, look, if you've got a commercial zone, allow residential in it too. Let developers build that first floor shop with the apartments above it. A lot of towns in New Hampshire don't allow that. It's illegal, right? So that's the kind of thing we're saying is you can do this rather than have the legislature say, like the legislature has tried in the last couple of sessions and it's got voted down to pass a law that says where there's water and sewer hookup, if you have single family zoning, you have to allow a fourplex. Well, I understand why people have a reaction against that. You don't have to go that far to make real progress. You can, at the local level, say, okay, let's take a look at our maps. Where are some areas in our town where we can say we don't have duplexes now, but they could be allowed in the future? Or let's take this 2-acre minimum lot size and make it half an acre, right? So make it 3/4 of an acre. Like there's ways you can do it that don't abolish zoning. I think people hear zoning's the problem and they leap to, oh my God, they want to get rid of zoning entirely. Like that's not what that's where we're going if nothing gets solved. If local governments don't take on this problem and start to change these things, you're gonna get legislation that says you can't do X, Y, and Z, and it is going to pass.
I actually think there's a bill in there regarding zoning this year.
Right? And so it's coming, but it's on local governments to start to look at this and make those changes that make sense to say maybe we don't need a 50-foot setback for every house. Those are things that you can, right? Go to downtown. Everybody loves downtown Portsmouth. Everybody loves walking around downtown Portsmouth, right? Maybe you don't want to live there, but you like walking around doing the shops, right? What makes downtown Portsmouth special? It's a colonial town that pre-existed zoning. You go there and there's shop, house, shop, house. They're right up against the sidewalk. There's literally no setback.
I'd argue that people probably do. I would guess that the housing prices in downtown Portsmouth are not cheap.
No, exactly.
That's precisely because people do in fact want to live there.
Right, because they want to live there, but they've also disallowed new building, right? So, you can do this in ways that don't mean abolish zoning. I just want to make that super clear.
I just want to make it clear that from a local government point of view, the planning commission has no flexibility. The planning commission follows the zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance is a development of the master plan, which is voted on by the township. The Board of Appeals or Adjustment, Zoning Board of Adjustment, can make changes in setbacks and certain aspects of. Just last night, there was a matter that came up. It was 75-foot setback. There was only the new development was going to be 5 feet short of the 75 feet. Zoning Board of Adjustment approves that development. So that's from the zoning side. Master plan makes the decision. The voters vote on the master plan. The board and election and being elected to the board meant absolutely nothing. You couldn't do anything. Going to the Zoning Board of Adjustment, at least we had some flexibility. But as a realtor, I want to just say this, because I have offer after offer that gets turned down. Last week, I think I set a record. My client had an offer in. There were 43 offers on a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house. My client was all in. He had a pre-approval for about $450,000, bid it all in, no inspection, didn't get the property. With 43 other bidders on that particular property. What's causing this is really that individual like that is limited in how high he can go. Why? Because of something much larger than what you guys are talking about. And I love talking about local politics. I love talking about New Hampshire politics. But what we really are affected by in our housing right now are the interest rates and the feds and the spending that's going on in this country. That's really the bottom line. My guy 3 years ago wouldn't have had any problem qualifying for a loan, except for now we're at 8% interest rate. At the 8% interest rate, his max is $450,000. He can't go up to $470,000 a bid to win that property. And that's our problem right now. The other aspect of that is 72% of the home mortgages in New Hampshire today are at 4% or less. Why would I want to sell a house? Why do I want to sell a house that I'm paying 4% on to buy another house at an inflated rate? By the way, the inflation on real property in New Hampshire over the last 5 years was 72%. Why would I want to sell a house now and risk paying 8% plus buying a home that is 72% higher in value?
I appreciate those points, and I think you have an excellent point about the zoning rules, right? The master plan. So towns, like if you live in a town, you can put a warrant article on to change your rules. So just people should understand that that's a great point. On the inflation and the interest, I'll go back to the research we've done on the market, and that is making it worse right now, but that's not the cause of the problem. Again, I'll go back to 1998. The median price for a single-family home in New Hampshire was $127,000. In 2005, it was double that, from 1998 to 2005. That's way before any of this stuff with recent inflation started. And now it's $470,000, right? So we've had the inflation and the COVID pump up already ridiculously inflated prices, and those were caused by the shortage of housing in New Hampshire.
So very quickly, I want to introduce Max Otona in the back there. Max, from St. Anselm's Center of Ethics and Society. He's done a lot of work in the housing space. And I have one last question. I see Representative Gerhard wanted to say something. Make it quick, please.
We have Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock buying single-family homes or whole developments across the country. There was a vote in the State House last year to prohibit corporations from owning single-family homes. I was actually the only Republican to vote for that because corporations are not people. And I think these old-school towns that we're talking about, Amherst and stuff, so forth, they weren't built by corporations. It's Joe the blacksmith built this house here, and Johnny the baker built this here. And I think ceding our control to these mega corporations, so those three corporations, they have controlling interest of 88% of the S&P 500 companies. That's what I'm concerned about, is we have these mega corporations coming in, which are really governments.
But they buy like less than 0.5% of the housing, right? So that they're just not a big player.
But
in the
it's not
housing
addressing
market.
the crux of the problem, though. The crux of the problem is not that corporations are buying housing as investments. The crux of the problem is that we have made housing a good investment. And we've made housing a good investment because we don't build enough of it, so we allow it to appreciate by 10 or 12% every year. As long as housing is competitive with stocks, it's always going to be an investment, and someone's always going to buy it. If not a big corporation, other investors are going to sit on it and just let it appreciate, and then they'll sell it for a profit later. The only way to address the crux of this problem is not by saying BlackRock can't buy it or whatever. It's by making housing not an attractive investment alternative to equities. Once you do that, they'll go back and they'll invest in other things. But if you just try to fix the symptom, you're never going to address the underlying problem. The underlying problem is to make housing cheaper by building more of it. That solves all these problems.
And I want to give Max a chance to say a few words, but then we got to wrap it up.
Thank you, Greg. I came a little bit late, so I missed the early part of your remarks, but I know from knowing each one of you, I agree with everything you said. And I especially want to thank Representative Alexander for his work on the Special Committee of Housing. They're doing great work, and we're really hopeful for what you're
Sucking up to a St. A's guy, I see.
But I will say just simply, our Center for Ethics in the Society published a New Hampshire Zoning Atlas this year with a great team of partners from around the state. And it became very clear to us there is an affordable housing crisis. And the reason for that crisis is a shortage of supply across New Hampshire's communities. And the reason for the shortage of supply is that we're restricting the supply, new homes from being built because of restrictive zoning. We did a study across the state of what communities have done with zoning, and it became very clear that across the state, communities are banning almost everything except large lot single-family homes. That's it. They're making it hard to build small lot single-family homes on less than an acre, duplexes on small lots, multifamily housing, accessory dwelling units. We have accessory dwelling unit legislation, as Representative Alexander knows, but communities find ways of restricting it with high parking requirements, requiring a public hearing, requiring it to be attached, not allowing owners to not live on the property. Manufactured housing. They're restricting that. So we have a serious problem, and the way to solve it is to let people who own property to build homes to solve the shortage. It's supply and demand. There's a demand for housing, and people want to solve it. There are developers and there are property owners, but communities have prevented them from doing that. And to my mind, restrictive zoning is an example of government overreach. And that's, to me, what needs to be restricted. That government overreach, that restrictive zoning, in order to allow people to freely solve this problem. So that's my perspective on that.
Can I make one quick plug? I think Max's day job is as an ethics professor. So if anybody wants to wax poetic about the ethical implications of housing, maybe Max can give us a lecture at some other time.
All right, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's gone a little long. I want to thank our group here. I want to thank Drew. I want to thank Adam. I want to thank Joe. Thanks everybody for coming out tonight. But as I said, there's a bunch of swag on the table back there. Chris is going to be very upset if there's anything left. He told our staff that their job is to get rid of all of it. So please feel free to grab some of that. And thank you. Have a great night.